will be, I'll keep the chat window open. We'll make this as usual conversational. So if you have any questions, and please feel free to interrupt me. This week during the practical and during the worksheet and the practical and other things, will the courses be available? No, it's way too early, Daniel, because there's a really crucial ingredient that won't be introduced until the very first week of, and then it will be released probably at the end of the first week. But the idea is that I'm going to start giving you material that will build towards it, build towards your coursework, right? That's probably going to be quite important for you to appreciate, and so you know that you're already working towards your coursework. I'll just make a note so I don't forget something to tell you in this session. Right, I'm going to hit record, make sure the recording is going good. It is going. Okay, so as I say, this week, I know that you've had other deadlines, several people have, so attendance hasn't been brilliant with worksheets, and I'm not sure how much time you've given over, but it's not going to be a huge obstacle. Things do go up and down, and you have to juggle it around in terms of what you're doing. So in front of you, I'm sharing my screen of basically what you would have done and completed if you'd completed week 5's practical to some extent. So no, not over the break period. Ethan, you're getting the coursework when you get back, because the deadline will be, I don't know, 12th or 11th. It's that week of May, and you'll get it issued at the end of the week, beginning the 19th. How do we get the get import prompt? Do we just write the prompt in the brackets? Nick, I'm not sure I understand the question. How do we get the get int prompt? Do we just write the prompt inside? Yes, you do. Okay, so what I'd like to do, thank you, Charlotte. You understood the question. Yes. Okay, yeah, feel free to chat with each other about this, but please, as I say, ask, so I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Okay, so Storm, that's a good question. This is week 5 worked example. You don't have to. I will put after this lecture, zip it up and pop it in there so you can use it to play with and have a look as a kind of a solution, a version of a solution. Now, what we're going to do in this lecture is work through and consolidate the critical concepts and how they link to the coursework, okay? We're going to have a deadline for coursework on the 19th. The deadline will be the week ending the 14th of May. Now, I'm not sure I can make it the 14th. It will probably be the 12th of May. I just have to confirm that because of you enter the exam period immediately after, so we'll be marking. But Andres, as the point I'm trying to make is that I'm not going to leave it till after Easter. Just to answer and reassure some of you, what I'm going to do is the week 7 material. I'll just make this explicit now. The week 7 material, so that's essentially the week you get back. Because your practicals will be before my lecture, I don't want to delay it even further, so I will release that during Easter. Now, what I'm rewriting that week material, because what I'm doing is giving you a variation on the coursework. So if over Easter you build week 7's material, including the worksheet it gives you, and you go through it all, you've essentially built a variation with some adaptation of what your coursework's actually going to do with you. And that will get you going along that particular way. Okay, so it gives you time, gives you a good lead-in time into it. Does the worksheet 6 not? It does, Robert, yes. So worksheet 6, I'll double check this with Matthew, will probably be the last worksheet I'll do with you, and we'll mark it in the first week of your return, okay? But the week material for week 7, which is the week we'll mark the worksheet 6. And can I just say something? If you've got any outstanding worksheets, depending on workload and number of people who are suddenly got tons they want to get marked off, we will try to mark 5 and 4. If I've said to you because you've had some specific issue, yes, I will do it, that's different. But for everyone else, because we haven't had anywhere close to 60, 70% of people marking their sheets, you might think, okay, let's just try to get those easy marks. But you'll have to rely on the fact we may just run out of time, okay? And you may run out of motivation, because when you get the coursework issued, your minds will obviously turn to the coursework. So let's not leave the coursework. What I'll do next week in the next week's lecture is I will set up your Easter break, okay? The material I'm going to give you in your Easter break, which will lead directly into your coursework. So theoretically, if we didn't have the 3-week gap, next week's lecture would lead you to week 7. And week 7 is the material that directly builds on what we've been doing so far. So think in your minds like this. Week 3, we did arrays. Week 5, we have done an array inside an object. And week 7, we will build the basic architecture for the coursework. So we'll do that as a worked example in week 7. I will also introduce one other concept in possibly week 8. But whether I actually, well, we'll talk about that later. That's not an issue now. So let's kind of start shaping this thing up and having a look at this example. So in front of me, I have this example, which was week 5's material. I just pulled it together very quickly from the lecture notes from week 5 with some minor variation. So look, I have the integer array class. So in there, I'm storing that. I've got an index, and for those who have gone through this and gone through the lecture notes, I don't propose to do that now. Basically what it has is a constructor where you build, what have I done? Where you build, you pass in a size to the constructor. If you come over, I'm going to go through this quickly. You can, as it's recorded, go back through it, pause it, make sure it's clear to you, but not now. We need to move into this a little bit faster, okay, to save giving you repetitive material. Okay, so, the constructor there links to that line here, right? When I build my object, I pass it an array size. So when we come over here, it's passed in here, I build my empty array. I then add elements to it using this append method. I pass it in here. So if you look back in the application, you'll see there's a loop here. And we'll talk about why I'm using a while loop as well, and what this is array full concept does, because that's actually a nice way of doing it. It has a kind of logical value. But remember, all the code, we'll talk about that later. Anyway, you grab a value from the user, and then you add it using the append value. You come over here, the append needs to check if the array is full. If it does, it won't add it or append it. Basically means the same thing. If it doesn't return out of here, it continues down here, takes the current index, which is this value which is stored privately inside this class, and assigns that value. Then it increments the current index. So when you come back round and append another value, the next index will be going up. This array full will be a check it will do. The array full check asks if the current index is equal to or greater than the actual length. And we know that the index should always be 1 below. Okay, so I'll come to your point in a second, then it will return true, otherwise it will return false. And you notice in this if statement here, this simply exits this method with a positive return. That's why I don't need an else condition, because if you think about it logically, if that's true, it returns. So I just need to pop a return false there. Okay, so anyone who is scared about the coursework, this is the way to think about it. It is actually a handful of really critical concepts. I was talking to Peter about this after the practical this morning. And the main concept of your architecture that I'm building is architectural, right? And what it does is it builds on week 5. Week 5 is quite critical, that you have an array of values inside this array. So this integer array example is very good, a very simple starting point. This has already been answered, but does the coursework get released after Easter? Yes, it does. I should have let someone else answer that, but Matthew, that's fine. I don't mind repeating answers. Yes, so coursework released after Easter. I've just essentially, let me just give you an update. Looking at the way that the material has gone, listening to the kind of feedback, how we've kind of evolved, how things have moved, I've rewritten a kind of model solution for the coursework. And interestingly enough, Nick, if he's here attending, made a statement about something which was quite illogical about clients. I can't remember if he will remember, but it struck a thought in my head that I needed a better use of the user interface. So if he's not here, oh, there you are, Nick Karparov, you. I'm thanking you for actually drawing the thought which I had bubbling away in my back. Yep, I had a thought bubbling away in the back of my head about the way I did this coursework last year. I wasn't happy with it. And when you asked me something and said, "Now that's illogical," or "I'm not really comfortable with that," you made me think again about this whole issue and whole question. Yes, they are. If so, why would you write private when we declare them? Okay, that's a different question. We'll come back to that. Oh, no, the thing is, when you write Java, you make everything explicit, because there are three different categories. They are private, but they're private within a scope. I was talking to Matthew about the issue of privacy. So anyone who doesn't understand, Nick has just asked this question about private variable names here. If they are private, they're private within a particular scope. And I think the scope is the package. I was discussing this with Matthew because Zach last week said, what happens if you lose it? And we noticed it wasn't visible in the client. But it's actually, the default behavior is not what you can rely on. You need to make it explicit yourself, so you make it absolutely strict in that way. Okay, so where was I? Oh, we're talking about the append. We've got array full. You've got a method here called toString. Now here's a little pointer. The toString method, you will write your own for the coursework. Think about it like this. This is a simplified version of what you will be building, right? But you won't be using integers. You will be using your own custom classes. That's it. I'm not going to say too much about that because that's a bit later. Now the sort also, I've copied the sort in. I don't know how many of you had a go at the sort this week, and did you get it to work? Yep. Okay. It's okay. So which of you are doing computer science next year? Excellent. So quite a lot of you. Brilliant. No, Robert, you didn't. You're swapping. Hector, you're leaving comp science and going to software engineering? Okay. Right. So that concept there where you call the method, so you got sort. For those who didn't do this, I would recommend doing that breakout exercise, because I will ask you to software engineering too. Okay. Yeah, I just draw a distinction. You probably know it yourselves, but the cybersecurity gang, right? And data science, there's nothing wrong with data science. Right, so the distinction between software engineering and computer science is perhaps this. For this, isn't the left hand and right hand redundant, as they're essentially the temp values that you use? Yeah, they sort of. Yeah, it's just a version of it. You can strip that code back enormously. Bear with me a second. Okay, apologies for that. Yeah, no, I'm back again. Okay, so anyway, let's not get too distracted by other things. Yes, you can do the sort in a number of different ways. This is just a version of it, and it just gives you something to work with. And of course, I'm going to just talk about a couple of things in this lecture. And one of the things that links to it is that, yes, you can redo the mechanism of your sort differently, how you declare variables. This relies on an integer as your basic element, okay? I wouldn't put a double in there. If I read someone's comment, you don't need a double in here. The index should always be an integer for logical reasons. Okay, so that's basically what you would have built, or you have built, or a version of it. You also will have something like this in your client. So you'll have, well, some of you didn't do this. Some of you didn't use your console interface where you had your getints and your prints and stuff like that. And I want to talk to you about that in a moment. So you grab the size of the array, you build the object, you've got a loop, you populate it, and in my case, I just display it pre-sorted. I then run the sort and then I post-sort it. So let's just run my version because it's quite basic and just check that it all simply works. So enter the size of the array, let's say 4. And it's really, really simple. So that just tests, okay, that just tests that it works. Now, there are a couple of things here. There's been a number of conversations about the whole role of this console manager. It will actually be, if you started building one, you have already started building part of your coursework. One of the elements of the coursework will be for you to use a console manager typecast, console actions, console interactions, etc. Why am I doing it? It's because it emphasizes this really crucial separation, right? I had this interesting conversation a couple of times this week. If you think about the architecture of a Java application, I'm going to change the folder structure here to emphasize it. Okay, so the first is I want all of my server objects, right, in their own package. So my server is this integer array. In your coursework, it will be the relevant classes, right? So I drag it into there, it will refactor it. Now, server objects, the rule for server objects is this. If you don't pay attention to this rule and you put user interaction into these server objects, you will lose marks in your coursework, right? This distinction is absolutely critical for good and fundamental practice, let's just say for object-based coding. And now I say that, but some textbooks mess this up. So if they have it in your textbook, then that page should be burnt because it's actually not very helpful. This is not an academic exercise. I am not teaching you Java purely for the sake of trying to get you through an academic module. I'm trying to teach you a practice. So when you go on from this module and you go on and you do software engineering and stuff like that, the concepts won't disappear. They'll just mutate depending on the language you're using and adapt. I mean, JavaScript uses, it uses objects all over the place as well. It's become fundamental. But here's a critical element. Server objects tend to sit on back-end servers. So if we think of a web system, for example, as a simple, or a mobile system, not everything will sit on your device or on your client. So server objects are basically, they do the heavy lifting. They do all the tons of important work, but critically, they also relate to databases and database interaction, data interaction. But what they can't have is any user interface stuff in them. That's critical. So I put the relevant, and this architecture I'm giving you is the one you can use for your coursework. So you have a bunch of server objects, but then you will also have, let's get another package, client objects, right? Or we'll just call these the client, right? And then your client will be your console manager and your application. So let's just drag them in, it will refactor it and link all my file up. So this is the basic architecture that's fundamentally written through perhaps every job description you get. So I've just got a colleague who has a routine, who has a recruitment company, who was asking me about advertising a role. And if you read what's typically out there, it's a mixture of front-end development, i.e. JavaScript, web-based, is often the most popular front-end language out there. So those who are doing software engineering, you're going to get a good shot at those type of things. But it also has back-end stuff as well. Someone who can, in Java, build a back-end server objects which do stuff and which can be deployed and connected and used in the front end. Now that architecture is built into how the course works. So in the coursework, you will be expected to keep that separation rigid. That means that in your main, right, you can have all your user interaction, right? But by building a console manager or a console actions or a console utility or a console library, you've had tons and tons of different names for it, and all those names are valid. You're not going to have any issue in this coursework about you've got to call it console, whatever I said it was. But my point to you is that build this because you will actually be able to just import it straight into your coursework project. So what's the advantage of it? Well, the obvious advantage is that you don't have to write system out statements anymore. You don't have to go and do the whole scanner stuff. All the scanner stuff is wrapped within the console manager class, actually within specific calls within it, right? And there are several different ways you might want to do it. You might want to add a constructor to your console because it's an object. And in the constructor, you build a scanner object. Now, what's a disadvantage of that is that you may not request input. So you're actually building an object that you're not using. This process where you have a method and you create the object, use it, and then it goes out of scope and it clears up, is, if you like, an extreme version that comes from heavy demand website type of logic. It's not, there isn't an absolute rule here, but you'll see the relative significance of each of them. So very first point to make to you is that you will be required to build a console manager which will manage all your output and input. That'll be a minimal requirement of it. Now, if you've been following what the lectures have been doing, you've built one, and several of you are sharing them. If you are going to share them, because it's going to contribute towards your coursework, rename them and make sure that they're yours. Okay. Of course, there's only so many different ways you can write get int and so on. Right. So that's part of it. That's part of what you've already been doing for your coursework. So the idea is this: when you hit with your coursework, you should be able to deal with it conceptually. What is the coursework asking me to do in terms of concepts? So I'm going to talk you through this, and I'm going to do some really strange things with this. Okay. Can you explain what the advantage of having console manager not static? Yes, because Nick, you can do what I'm going to demonstrate. By using it as an object, it can have a state, which means that I can, you see this line here, see this object here, which are my server objects, right? I don't have to have them in my main. In fact, if you're going to follow my line of thought now, hopefully you will, it might answer your question. It should answer the question. No, you don't really want to have it static if you want to get it fully usable. You want to have it managing data related to your user interface in some way. You want it, having a state is actually a huge advantage. And I'm going to give you a simple example of it. Right. This main builds your console manager, right? Then it asks the console for the size of the array, and then it creates the object. So you have an interesting question here. If you've got a console object, right, why not do this inside the console? So basically your console manager has a private member variable, and it has int, let me get it, int array. And let's call it, what do we call it over here? We call it IR, that'll do. Now, there are several advantages, and one of the advantages of this concept, let me just import it into here because it can't see it. Give me a second. So you see up here, you can actually get rid of this. And if you put an asterisk up in your import statement, everything in that package is visible. So let me just import that into the console. Now remember, the console app, the console manager, which I'm calling it now, right? You can call it console library, whatever you like, is taking away the user interface mechanisms, right? So you can concentrate on what your code does. Now, I'll explain this in terms of two things. The first is that the coursework is more complicated than these examples, and you can get in such a mess if everything you are doing is in your main, right? Actually, if you look at even this is just a bunch of mechanisms. That's a mechanism to create the object, right? Appropriate size. That's a mechanism to populate. That's a mechanism to display, so that's fine. We can try something. That's straightforward. That's just a sort mechanism, but you know, and that's a mechanism for displaying it again. Now, here's an interesting strategy. I build my object here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a method in my console manager, and it's called attach server object. And I'm going to pass into here a reference to my server object, right? So that's the internal one. That's just a reference. I haven't created the object. So what I do is I use the word this, which means it's a member variable, and I make it the same as the parameter. Hang on, I haven't written that correctly. Why is it complaining? What have I done? Oh, because that's int array. Sorry. Here we go. Right, now, this has a very interesting consequence, right? What that means is that, okay, so I build it here, but look at this next block of code, right? That's pure mechanism. That's not so much a concept, that's a mechanism. Now, when you're debugging a complex piece of code, the more you're able to replace mechanisms in your client with the concept of what it's trying to do, the easier it is to debug complex programs. Look at that. That creates a loop that gets the stuff. What happens if I just had for my console, I said this. I had something I could just do this. Populate array. And I could replace those 3 lines by that call on that object with a method called populate array. So I could take those lines out, go and grab them, and create a public void populate array, drop that inside here. And the first question you might ask is actually, you don't need a reference to the console because I'm inside the class, so I don't need that anymore, right? So this will teach you how to use class methods within the same thing, right? But have a look at this. Why does that work? Why is that not complaining? If I come back to here, and why is that not complaining? Well, actually it will complain, because if you think about it, I need to run that line of code. So I actually attach the object that I've created out here. So if I do this, if I go console dot attach server object, and I pass it the server object, this does something very, very useful. Okay, and this is really, really where object-oriented programming comes into its own. Because you're not passing a copy of the object around, you're passing the address, the location of the object. When I write that and I pass it into this method here, I've created it here, so I've got access to it here, but I'm passing a link, a reference. So this has a member variable which is waiting to find an address reference, which is going to hang on to. That statement there, the equal sign, means that that is not a copy of the object I created out there, but it's a reference to the actual object. So now within the console manager, I can wrap several lines of code and do this, right? So if I come back here, I now have some interesting lines of code. I now have populate array. So I could, in theory, I could do all of this if I wanted to, inside my console manager if I wanted to, and that's an option you might like to consider. I'm happy to leave it as this. Yeah, so Nick, that's a very, very good question. Yeah, okay, so okay, let's go through this slowly. There is a concept, one of the most tricky concepts that we teach you in object-based programming or object-oriented programming is called referencing and address referencing. It's linked to what Nick has just said. Is it like a pointer in C++? It's exactly like a pointer, but it's not a pointer. A pointer used to be a mechanism in these older languages where whenever you created an object, you weren't passing the object around, right? Okay, so Hector and Max, bear with me, you're probably a representative of a sizable proportion, right, of the group. So what I'm going to try to do is just do a diagram to make this concept clear. But before I do that, let me just give you every day, right? I'll give you a very, very quick summary. I'll go into it a little bit longer, but what I'm going to get at is this. The console manager, look how neat. Think about it. You could use stack and heap. Yeah. Yeah, possibly. Yeah, you could do that. I'll let you share that with others if you want to. I don't want to get too sidetracked by the reference issue. The point I'm trying to make to you is this. Your main should be literally, I'll give you an example. The coursework main, which does much more complex stuff, is not much longer than that. Okay. And the only reason it's not much longer than that, and yet it's clear what it's doing, and it was easy for me to debug and spot all my errors, is because I attached the server objects to my console. And then once they're in here, this console manager is now acting like another, it's acting like a way of interacting with my user interface and my back end and front end. It's helping me manage the two relationships, right? Now that's kind of quite a big step. So I'll just pause there. Let me add another ingredient, right, to this whole thing. This is so simple, you know, you could chop this up in any way you like. David, that's absolutely right. I am going to, now that you're another person who's just asked, let me just turn on a little camera here and share with you, grab a sheet of paper and just see if I can clarify it, okay, a little bit more. It is actually, if I were to say to you that, you know, you can become a programmer, you can learn how to write code, but to write really good object-oriented code is to understand the points that are being raised in this. The business about this thing called a pointer, about passing by reference and not by value. Let me try to spell this out and why it's so important, because what it does, crucially, from your point of view, if you are confuzzled, is a nice word actually, then just bear with me for a second. You can go back over this. Let's see if I can give you a decent explanation for it that might just help make sense of it. Let me just open up a camera. Bear with me a second. There we go. Right. So hopefully you can all see that. That's reasonably clear. A little bit bright on the bright side. Let's grab a pen and try to just make it clear. So objects, right, are generally considered in object-oriented programming as great. Is there a dark theme? What to this? You know, you mean reverse invert my colors? Objects are generally considered huge data structures. If you think about an integer, right, which is a primitive data type, you could literally think of the bytes that it occupies in your RAM, right? And it's kind of such a small data type, it occupies so little data, it's very simple in its structure, that it's reasonably straightforward. A string is not a basic data type. A Java string is actually an object. So what it has within it are a whole bunch of methods. And a good example that I spoke to Jack with today is toUpper, toLower, etc. And inside it, it stores private member variables to manage a string. That's a much bigger structure than just primitive data type. Okay. So when we come to objects, we have a big problem. If I've got a bit of code, right, I've got some function or method, and I want to get hold of an object I've created in one part of my code, and I want to pass it into this function and the function to act on it and give it back or do stuff with it. If I end up critically taking the whole object and making a copy of the object, so there's the original one, think of it like this, right? I've got an invoice, right? Say this is an invoice, and I want a department to act on that invoice. Now here, this analogy might actually help bring out the issues related to it quite well. So this is an invoice, and I've got a department who process invoices. So what do? Do I give them my original invoice, or do I make a photocopy of the invoice and give them the photocopy? Right now, let's just say that part of the job they do is they scribble critical comments and dates and marks on the copy you give them. And if I give them a copy, right, my original one is still the same. It has none of the marks. Now, what happens if they misplace theirs and the only copy I have was my original invoice? I've got no evidence that they've even done anything to it. If you follow my analogy so far, ignore programming, just follow this analogy, right? But let's say that I have an invoice and I have a department on the second floor who process invoices. I don't need to keep a copy of it. I just give them the invoice. They do everything they need with the invoice. They scribble what it is and they pass it to wherever it needs to go. So the downside of that is they could screw up your invoice. They could write junk on it or they could lose it. Then you've lost your data. Well, you've lost your invoice, right? In programming, it's not that, it doesn't create such a big problem because the analogy breaks down. So the issue for programs and programming and object-oriented programming is, do we pass objects around, big chunks of data from here to there, whenever we pass them into functions, right? Or do we say, look, there's the original piece of document. If I'm going to, by analogy, if I'm going to give you the invoice, right, I'm going to give you that ampersand represents the address. And what do I mean by that? And think of it like a place where that particular object lives in your organization. No one moves it, but everyone knows how to get access to it, right? But that object also controls access because remember, it's got methods which create the way that you access that. But everyone knows where it is. It's like an in tray with someone sitting there by the in tray. Every time you want to do something with that data in there, you have to go through the interface, the public methods, right? It's a big, complex little structure. It's a complex structure. So rather than actually make a copy of the original data and a copy of the person who's also managing it, which would be literally the analogy for it, the dog is making a horrible noise, you pass the address around. So everyone who needs access, you pass the address. So actually hidden away, whenever we pass objects in methods, we're passing the address, the location for it. So that has a really powerful implication for object-oriented programming. When you master that concept, you suddenly notice tricks that you can do when you code. Let's come back to my code again. Right, so here I created an object which was built from my class IntArray, and my object is called iArray. Just to make this absolutely explicit, I'm going to rename it and just call it my object. Okay. So you can, so I can just follow the line of thought with me, right? I take the object and I look like I'm giving it to this method over here, right? It looks like I'm just passing it into there. Now, some people say, is that a copy you're giving? No, that is just the address, the location of that object. The moment you've created it, when you create it, you give it both a location, you occupy a chunk of RAM, if you like, crudely put, right? And it's got some real estate in your hard and your, I don't know what the dog is barking about, right? That real estate is not going to move. So when I come over to my console manager and I have this method and it looks like I'm receiving an object, I'm not. I'm receiving the address of the object, which rather than use the ampersand sign, I mean, you know, rather than write that, okay, or rather than write that, which is the address of the object, we only write that for simplicity's sake, but actually we are passing the address. So when this equal sign comes into place, this is where it gets really bizarre and really quite abstract. So if you don't get it and it carries on buzzing and confuzzling your mind, please go back through this and make sure you're confident and you grasp this concept because it's so powerful, and hopefully I can demonstrate the power of it. But when I write this line, I'm not taking that and putting it into some other data. I am, yeah, taking the address, the location of it, and referencing it in here. Did I mean that? Sort of. So Nick mentioned pointers. It's almost like a pointer. So when I come back up here, this object here is now pointing to exactly the same place that the original object. So that object over here called my object, it's sitting in RAM, it's got its real estate, it's got its address, you know, 35 Zoo Lane, 64 Zoo Lane. Some of you might recognize that reference, right? Say my object lives in 64 Zoo Lane. This is also pointing to 64 Zoo Lane. The huge advantage is that I can internally inside this object, this class, manipulate it and access it. I can call its methods. I can call the append. And at the moment, that's what I'm doing at the moment. George of the Giraffe, yeah, good old days. But I've got two kids, and yeah, the number of times we watched all of that stuff. Yeah. Sorry, that's a bit of light entertainment just to kind of break the rather abstract. I was hoping not to get so abstract. So my point here for you, that are you, okay. Right, so uh, you said almost what is the difference? If it points to an address in memory, I know it's a pretty technical question, but I'm asking out of curiosity. Yeah, pointers, Nick, the difference is that a pointer was actually a specific data type related to C. And what a pointer did was it had a mechanism built into it called dereferencing. Just a purely technical level, what it did is it did hold the address of the object, it pointed to it, but you could do a process called dereferencing the pointer, and that process let you get access to the content. With this mechanism, if think of it like this, the pointer concept is buried inside it, right? You don't have to what's called dereference it. This is technical, ignore this for everyone else. You don't have to dereference it to use it. So look over here, I can just call it as if I've got direct access to it. Hopefully that makes sense. But if folks, if any of you, especially cyber students here, hear what Nick is asking and you hear stuff about pointers, the language C is really, really useful for cyber students to learn. I did have a booklet, 40-page booklet, which gave really good introductory stuff right up to arrays and pointers and the rest of it. Yeah, exactly. Java sort of sits on top or draws from them both. Absolutely right there. Okay, so I kind of got off on a tangent. The critical element and the link to your coursework, which was the point of the whole session, I hope we haven't lost that focus, is that you can, if you do this type of strategy, you attach it, right? I don't know, I don't have to call it attach. So let's just say, let's rename it. What would be a better name based on what we've just been talking about? Let's say get reference. What happens if I just called it get reference, right? So let's come back over here. See, the concept is clearer. There we go. That might be clearer and easier to read. I've got my object, I get the reference, and I'm holding the reference to it inside the console manager. And that's what that equal sign does. So now inside the console manager, I can create methods like populate, hide that whole console interaction stuff, which wraps that particular server-based action, right? Now, this is not going to, this level of complexity is not going to be demanded to pass the coursework, right? This is for those students in here who think, how much flexibility, how much can I bend the concepts that we're doing? So here's a rule. Server objects can themselves have no reference to user interface, right? If you do that, you're making a cardinal error, a cardinal sin, and the great God of programming will send you to programming hell. I'm not sure what programming hell would be. I know what programming hell would be. Anyone have an idea what programming hell would be? It would be coming, this is a bit cruel. Emoji code, there is such a thing. Yes, absolutely. What's that one? Semicolon 1000. That, Charlotte, is brilliant. Haskell, you'll do Haskell next year, David, if you're doing comp science. Though Matthew is thinking of changing it. COBOL, yeah. Yeah, it's probably, here's a real programming help. If you need the object to the methods, Tom's got a sensible question. Hang on, writing in chicken, I like that. Right, Tom, if you need the object to do the methods in the second object, would it be better to require an object in the initializer? Yeah, so I think I understand your question. So I'm just going to do a slight variation before we end to see if I can answer that question and tell me if I do. But what would be real coding hell is that you never write a single line of code or coding in binary. You test other people's code. That's your job for eternity. Having had to work and do testing it's an essential part of it, but it's so tedious and it's so dispiriting because you never get the pleasure of creating stuff, right? Yeah. Right, so Tom, I'm going to try to answer your question because because your question actually asks an interest. I think you're asking, look, if you're asking this type of thing, why do I even worry about doing those two lines here? Why not manage the whole thing through the console? Why not inside my console constructor, why don't I do those 2 lines? Let me just take them out of there. Because this is why not having a static is an advantage, right? I'll create a constructor, console manager. And remember, the rule for a constructor is it's the code that you run when you build the object. Remember, I don't need that reference there. Have a look at that. Now, we actually don't need to worry about getting a reference to it anymore, right? Let's put the member variable in the right place. This is the other variation. Let's just shift something out. We don't need that anymore. Now look at that code. What's happened to my object? Ooh, that's interesting. Right, so now I've got some other interesting problems. Right, we'll come back to these errors. And now I think, Tom, this was your question. If you can do what I said, if building my console actually internally in the constructor builds my server objects and I manage everything to do with them, then all I need to do is create the top level. Yeah, they were reliant on the other class. So how would we do this? Well, you could do this, right? This is a bit lazy, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? Let's grab that one. Let's come to the console manager and let's stick that in there and let's wrap it in something. So let's call it, I don't know, public void print pre-sort. Now this is really long-winded and you wouldn't necessarily want to do this. This is just to illustrate a concept to you, right? There is no reason to have just a single print statement, right? It's not my object anymore. It is that, right? Okay, let's get print pre-sort, go to the application. So instead of that, we don't even use a single print statement. We do this, print pre-sort. That's even neater, right? Look at this, look at the conceptually what your program is doing. What is the advantage of what I'm showing you? And do the same thing with these. What the clear advantage is that when you're putting together a massively complicated program, for some of you, the coursework will feel fairly massive, right? Especially when you see what's going on with composition and how composition works. Don't Google it because there are several variations on how to understand the concept. And next week, I will give you a starting point for your coursework to get started, right? That's a very good question. I would say the difference, it's a good question. Was it bigger? I would say the thing I hated about the Python is that, as some of you already know, if you were able to do it with objects and classes, you could have done it in a tiny amount of space, relatively. What made it, actually it was clumsy because you couldn't use objects, and objects are the natural way of managing state. Think about your Python, right? For the challenge would be easy peasy if you were using objects. Because an object, you can create an array of the objects related to each of the individual patches you draw, for example. They each have their state. You can access their state, including their location data, the color data. You can manipulate it easily and render them so much more. If you made a second instance of the object when you use this int array, would the second int array intervene? Yes, it would. Yes, then you would. Okay, so Zach, you don't mind if I just ask your question out loud? What's crucial here in this distinction is that there should only be one, where am I? There should only be one object. Actually, that's not going to work. What I need to do is, I don't know if you notice there's an error. That should actually do that. Do we agree? Yes. So Tom, I have passed it into what you call the initializer, we call the constructor. I think that's what we're talking about. Yes. So Nick, next year and in the future years, it depends on what degree you're doing, because if you're doing cybersecurity, you'll do Python, you'll do some more Python. And actually you can, you can actually in your final year project do a Python project. So bear that in mind. If you really like Python, machine learning, I mean, against all of its negative elements that, you know, it's not as detailed, it is a fantastic machine learning language. And for the data scientists here, Python and R are kind of both very, very useful. Right, okay. So should we, let me just answer some questions here without over confusing what I'm doing. Okay, hang on. Let me just, before I come to yours, Tom, see, Adriana says, should we avoid user interaction inside the class? Should we have a populate function by itself, or should we populate? Okay, that's a very good question. Okay, so Adriana, your question is easier to answer than Tom, so I need to be clear about what Tom's asking in a sec. Notice on the client, this console manager is keeping my basic logic of my program really straightforward, right? Think of it like with your coursework. Okay, here's another hint. You're going to build a bunch of objects, and then you're going to have an infinite loop. And inside that infinite loop, you're going to display a whole bunch of options to the user to manipulate the data inside these server objects. Okay, that is probably the strongest hint other than actually showing it to you. Okay, so if this code is nice and simple, and all the hard work is done, all the user interface, all the displaying, all the getting the data from your server objects and passing stuff to it is managed out of sight, it makes it much simpler. Right, Tom, let me see if I can answer your question. It's not super complex. I'm just thinking of 100% needs something to be passed in. You want to pass it to the constructor. Yes, that's exact. But if you look, that's exactly, you mean this. Hang on, you mean this. Here, I'm not passing it anything. In this version, I am simply creating it inside the console manager. So let me just do Tom's variation, right? I come back out here. I create it out here, right? And this is int array, is that right? Hang on, let's just get the names all right. My names are going all over. No, that should be array, right? Get int, okay, I can't run that until I've built my console manager. So let's just, do you notice one thing here? The location of my console manager, I need the object in order to call get int. So there you get caught up in a kind of little bit of a chicken and egg scenario. You need that first, which means that if you want to use its constructor, how do you run those lines prior to building the object if you are going to pass the object in and you need to get the user to specify that? That's the issue here, right? So the easiest thing to do is drop it from there and actually in the constructor, do it entirely in the constructor. I hope that's clearer. Let's go back. Let me just answer some other, in your example, how's the program get the size? I'm unsure. Okay, so look at this, right? I create, look at this program here. I create my object. This line, because it will run the constructor in the console manager. So really early on, Nick, I think, asked the question, why is this not static? It's not static because, hang on a second. It's not static because I'm now going to store a reference to my server objects inside the console manager. Remember, it is just console management. It is all client-based stuff. This class is a wrapper to make all of those processes simpler. And believe me, with the way that the whole thing is going to work, you are going to want to make reusable code, wrapping code, right? The other really crucial element is that, you know, this statement here, populate array, makes conceptually really clear what's going on. Create your object, populate your array. So whatever's going on inside that, you're populating the array, right? Whatever's going on that is printing a pre-sort. The sort you could just call from, you could create, and you might think that this is a wasteful thing to do, but this is a very typical strategy in professional code writing. Look at this. I can create a public void sort, right? And you say, hang on a second, but we've already got a sort. What this sort is just a wrapper on the server object. If I can just spell it right, hang on, right? So this is a very, let's go back over here. Let's come over here. Let's get rid of that. And we say this. So what that does is you say, hang on a second, Nad, sort, that comes into here, but all that's doing is wrapping the server action. Well, the advantage is that wrapping code, anyone heard of APIs? API, you've heard of APIs, right? Yeah. API means application programming interface. Okay, and what they are is all about the interface. Think of it crudely Yeah, think of it crudely as the public methods of a server object, right? What this does, what this sort is nothing more than a wrapper on the interface of your server object. That's another way of understanding what I'm doing. It is a very common strategy in proper real life programming. You don't want to do that because, Tom, that is using the class, not the object. You see here, you've got to get this distinction right. If you try to use console manager statically, which is what that example shows, you're calling the array from it, it won't work. If it does work, it shouldn't work. It shouldn't allow you to. There might be some glitch in the history of Java where they never removed it. Yes, you could do that. Oh, no, 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 you don't want to do that because what you're doing in that version is you're making your array, exposing your array. Remember the logic. That is private. You want to hide it. Yeah, Tom, that's absolutely right. Yeah, spot on. So, okay, look, this kind of, yeah, we got a couple of problems in this code. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to zip this code up and give it to you. Next week's exercise, there is no new material. I'm going to give you, if you look at the lecture notes, it's literally, here's some client code, build the backend server object for it. Don't change any of the client code, but can you reverse engineer the backend? Why am I doing that? I'm doing that to get you to think about the relationships a little bit stronger, come at it from a different angle. What I will do in next week's lecture is I will, hopefully if I've got it written by then, or it will be written within a week after next week's lecture, the week 7 material to do with composition and the exercise, which you can work on over Easter, which will basically be a simplified variation on what you're going to build on to create your I'll give you the framework of it, right? How do I practice making search sort algorithms? That's a brilliant question, Gabriel. What you could do is take your integer array. Gabriel's asked a really interesting question. How do you practice making search sort algorithms, right? Look at that object there. You've already got a mechanism of building it, and you've got one type of sort in there already. So why don't you create more sorts? Why don't you create searches inside that array? Just make the array longer and practice it with an integer array. That will help you get those concepts. So for example, I don't know if you've heard of a binary search. A binary search takes a sequence of integers. It requires them to be sorted, then it splits them down the middle and it checks the middle value to see if it's greater or lesser than the value you're looking for. If it's less than, it goes to the bottom half, etc. And it's actually really efficient. So a binary search is a really good one and you can do it. Just build a binary search on the back of this integer array. That's not a bad thing to do. You know, funny thing is the non-comp science students here might like some of the programming material and exercises I give for my second year comp science students because I get them to build linked lists and all that kind of stuff. I don't know if Rich and his team do that because I don't think he's worried about it. But if you wanted to strengthen your backend server coding skills, then I am more than happy to share with you my second year material for linked lists and complex data structures, binary searches, and all kinds of bits and pieces like that. You can have access to that over the summer. Even if you're not doing comp science and you're going into software engineering, it will just make you stronger. If you are doing comp science, you will have a module with me where we're going to basically front end can be whatever you like. Yes, absolutely. I will share them with cyber you lot as well. Anyone who requests it, what I'll do is I'll gather them together, put them into a zip folder, and I'll make them available and get them out to you. But for comp science, just to answer the question, backend Java, front end, well, will be in Java. It could be an Android application. You might want to build a web application. You might want to build anything you like. I have a module where I basically let the student build any type of front end. And I give them the basic backend structure for them to develop and adapt. And it's basically to build a game. They get to build a game. So it's been a very popular thing. And if anyone wants to learn the basics of Android Studio, you're welcome for me to share that code material to you over the summer. Play with it as well. because, you know, you can do independent projects. I've got final year project students who are using the second year material I started them with to build their final year projects. So the aim is to link up all these different things. Yeah, I do. Sadly, I do use Java. My professional career was in C++ and C Sharp. So yeah, I hope you do enjoy that for next year. I hope, I mean, here's my thought, and I might not do this very effectively, but I am trying to give you lot a decent experience of this and a worthwhile educational experience. But the scenario I'm picking for the coursework, and I'll say make this last thing because we've gone 5 o'clock, is I'm going to get you to build basically a simplified architecture for something like a smart home, right? And that might or might not shock you or interest you, but hopefully you'll find it a lot more straightforward to get your head into and what's going on. So I will share with you the material and folks, and I will see you all. Thank you all for your patience and for your interesting questions.